First story by John Doe. The city at night is a different beast. The bustling life of the day gives way to a more sinister atmosphere as the sun sets. I never believed in the supernatural, always priding myself on my rational mind. But what I experienced one night in a dark aisle of the city still sends shivers down my spine. It was a late autumn evening, the kind where the chill in the air is just beginning to bite. I was walking home from work, a route I had taken countless times. The quickest way was through an alleyway, one I had traversed during the day without a second thought, but at night it transformed into a narrow, dimly lit corridor, hemmed in by the looming silhouettes of buildings on either side. As I entered the alley, a sense of unease washed over me. The usual city sounds seemed muffled here, replaced by a heavy silence that felt almost suffocating. I quickened my pace, eager to be out of the claustrophobic space. That's when I first heard it, a soft, scraping sound, like something being dragged across the ground. I paused, listening, but it stopped as abruptly as it had started. Convincing myself it was just a stray animal, I continued, but the feeling of being watched grew stronger. I could almost sense a presence behind me, lurking in the shadows. I turned around quickly, heart pounding, but there was nothing there. Just empty, dark alley, stretching back the way I had come. I resumed walking, but the scraping sound started again, this time accompanied by a faint, indistinct whispering. It seemed to be coming from everywhere and nowhere at the same time. My mind raced with possibilities. Was someone playing a cruel joke? Was it a homeless person hiding in the shadows? Or something else entirely? The whispering grew louder, morphing into a cacophony of hushed voices. I could almost make out words, but not quite. It was as if they were speaking a language just beyond the edge of comprehension. Panic set in, and I broke into a run, desperate to escape the alley. As I neared the end, the temperature dropped sharply, the cold biting at my skin. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, the whispering stopped, and the alley was silent once more. I emerged onto the well-lit street, panting and disoriented. Looking back, the alley was just an ordinary city lane, devoid of any sign of the terror I had just experienced. I've never been able to explain what happened that night. Was it my imagination, fueled by the eerie setting? Or did I encounter something truly unexplainable? I avoid that alley now, taking a longer route home. But sometimes when I pass by its entrance, I can't help but feel a chill, as if something unseen is still waiting there in the shadows. That story was chilling, but the next one is even more terrifying. Imagine walking the streets of New York City late at night, only to find yourself in a situation straight out of a horror movie. Second story by Jane Smith. New York City, the city that never sleeps. I always found comfort in its constant buzz and vibrant energy, but one late night walk transformed my perspective forever, turning the familiar streets into a maze of fear and uncertainty. It was just past midnight, and I had stayed late at the office. Living in Manhattan, I relished the short walks home, even at night. The city's bright lights always felt like a safety net, its streets filled with life no matter the hour. But that night, something was different. The usual crowds were sparse, and a thick fog had descended, muting the city's usual vibrancy. As I walked, the fog seemed to grow denser, swallowing the sounds of the city. The bright lights of the skyscrapers were reduced to faint glows in the mist. I felt a growing sense of isolation, as if I had stepped into a different world. The familiar streets seemed alien, the shadows hiding unknown dangers. My heart rate increased as I passed an unusually dark alley. I heard a sound that made my blood run cold. The soft, deliberate footsteps of someone following me. I quickened my pace, but so did the footsteps. I didn't dare look back. The fear of seeing who or what was behind me too overwhelming. Every rational thought told me it was just another late-night pedestrian, but the timing of their steps, perfectly echoing mine, suggested something more sinister. The streets, usually a source of comfort, now felt like a trap. In a moment of panic, I turned into another street, hoping to lose my pursuer. The footsteps stopped abruptly. I waited, my breath caught in my throat. But there was only silence. Just as I began to feel a sense of relief, a shrill scream pierced the night from the direction I had just come. It was filled with such terror that I froze, unable to move. After what felt like an eternity, I gathered my courage and cautiously retraced my steps. The street was empty, no sign of anyone, not even the person who had been following me. The screams still echoed in my mind, but there was no evidence that anything had happened. The rest of my walk home was a blur of fear and confusion. I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, of being not quite alone. When I finally reached my apartment, I locked the door behind me with shaking hands, the safety of home feeling more like a sanctuary than ever before. I never found out what happened on that street or who had been following me. The city offered no clues, its secrets swallowed by the night. But since that night, I've never walked the streets of New York City after dark in quite the same way. There's a shadow over them now, a reminder of the night, the familiar turned to fear. That story might have left you unnerved, but wait until you hear the next one. It starts as just a normal day in London, but what unfolds is anything but ordinary. Third story by Anonymous. London, a city steeped in history and mystery. I've always found its blend of the old and the new fascinating. But one day, what began as perfectly normal took a turn into the realm of the uncanny, leaving me questioning the very fabric of reality. It was a sunny Tuesday morning in spring. The city was alive with the hustle and bustle of people going about their day. I had a few errands to run in the city center, a routine I had followed countless times. Little did I know, this day would be anything but routine. As I walked through the crowded streets, I noticed a small, quaint antique shop I had never seen before. Being a lover of all things vintage, I felt drawn to it. The moment I stepped inside, I was hit by a wave of cold air, a stark contrast to the warmth outside. The shop was quiet, the only sound the ticking of numerous antique clocks on the walls. It felt like stepping into a different era. I browsed the shelves, admiring the various trinkets and artifacts. That's when I found it, an old, intricately carved music box. As I opened it, a delicate, haunting melody filled the air. It was mesmerizing, and for a moment, I lost myself in the music. When the melody stopped, I looked up, and the shop was gone. Instead, I found myself standing in the middle of an old Victorian-era street. The modern bustle of London had been replaced by the clatter of horse-drawn carriages and the murmur of a crowd dressed in period clothing. I was dumbfounded, unable to comprehend what had happened. Panic set in as I tried to make sense of my surroundings. Was I dreaming? Had I somehow traveled back in time? The people around me paid no attention, as if my appearance in their world was perfectly normal. I spent what felt like hours wandering the streets, each turn bringing me to more unfamiliar sights. Just as despair began to take hold, I heard the music box's melody again, faint but distinct. I followed the sound, and as I did, the world around me started to blur. The next thing I knew, I was standing back in the antique shop, the music box still in my hands. The shopkeeper, an elderly man with a knowing look in his eyes, simply said, "Ah, you've returned." Before I could ask any questions, he ushered me out of the shop, insisting it was closing time. When I turned around, the shop was no longer there, just an empty storefront. The rest of the day felt surreal, and I questioned whether the experience had been real or a figment of my imagination. The memory of that melody and the sights of a London long past stayed with me, haunting my dreams to this day. That experience might have been baffling, but our next story takes us to a night shift at a small store, where the line between the mundane and the supernatural becomes terrifyingly blurred. Fourth story by Emily Johnson. Working a night shift can be a lonely experience, especially in a small store on a quiet side street. But what I encountered one night made me question if I was truly alone or if some unseen presence was sharing my solitude. The store was a quaint little convenience shop, nestled in a less traveled part of the city. I'd taken the night shift because it was usually uneventful, a chance to catch up on studying with the occasional customer breaking the monotony. That night, however, was different from the start. It began with the lights. They flickered intermittently, which was not entirely unusual, but there was a pattern to it that felt almost like a Morse code. I tried to brush it off as a faulty electrical issue, but a creeping sense of unease settled over me. Then came the noises, soft, almost imperceptible at first. It sounded like whispers, but whenever I stopped to listen, they would cease, leaving me questioning my own sanity. The store's CCTV monitors showed nothing amiss, yet the feeling of being watched grew stronger. As the night progressed, the atmosphere in the store shifted. The air grew colder, and the silence seemed heavier, laden with anticipation. It was then that I noticed the items on the shelves subtly rearranging themselves. A can here, a book there, just enough to be noticeable, but easily dismissed as a trick of the mind. The defining moment came when I heard the sound of shuffling feet behind me. I spun around, heart racing, but there was no one there. The store was as empty as it had been all night. That's when I saw it. My own reflection in the mirror behind the counter. But it was distorted, twisted into a visage of terror. I couldn't move, frozen in place as I stared at the horrifying reflection. It felt like an eternity before the image slowly faded back to my normal reflection, leaving me shaking and confused. The rest of the night was a blur of fear and paranoia. Every sound made me jump. Every shadow seemed to hide a lurking figure. When my shift finally ended, I left the store at a run, not stopping until I reached the safety of my home. I never returned to that store, quitting the very next day. The experience left me with more questions than answers. Was it a ghost? A manifestation of my own fear? Or something else entirely? Whatever it was, it made me realize that sometimes the most ordinary places can hide the most extraordinary secrets. That story was truly spine-chilling, but our final tale for tonight might just be the most unsettling of all. It's a story of a night in the city where the darkness hides more than just shadows. Fifth story by Michael Roberts. A city at night can be a place of mystery and danger, its familiar landscapes transformed by the cloak of darkness. My story is one of such a night, where the line between reality and something far more sinister became disturbingly blurred. It was a summer night, warm and breezy, the kind that invites you to wander the streets and enjoy the city's nocturnal charm. I was out with friends, enjoying the nightlife. As the evening drew to a close, and my friends headed home, I decided to take a leisurely walk back to my apartment. The streets were lively, filled with the echoes of nightlife. But as I ventured into quieter parts of the city, the atmosphere changed. The bustling noise faded into a hushed stillness, and the bright city lights gave way to dimly lit streets, casting long, ominous shadows. As I walked, I noticed something odd. A figure standing motionless at the end of every street I turned onto. At first, I thought it was a coincidence, but it quickly became apparent that it wasn't. The figure was always there, just out of clear sight, its features obscured by the darkness. A sense of dread began to build within me. I tried to convince myself it was just a trick of the light, or a series of unrelated strangers, but the pattern was too consistent, too unnerving. The figure never seemed to get closer, but it was always there, a silent observer in the night. I started to take random turns, trying to lose this mysterious stalker. But no matter where I went, the figure appeared, its presence both enigmatic and threatening. My walk turned into a brisk jog, then a full run. I didn't stop until I reached the brightly lit main street, crowded with late-night revelers. Looking back, the figure was gone. I scanned the street corners and shadows, but there was no sign of it. The sense of being watched, however, lingered long after I reached the safety of my apartment. To this day, I don't know who or what was following me that night. Was it a person with ill intentions? A figment of my overactive imagination? Or something else entirely? The experience left me with a deep-seated wariness of the city at night, a reminder that sometimes the most ordinary places can be the setting for the most extraordinary and unsettling of events. Each of these stories takes us into a world where the ordinary becomes extraordinary, where the familiar streets we walk can turn into passages of terror. Thank you for joining me on this journey through urban horror. If you enjoy these tales, check out the recommended video on your screen now. It's one of my personal favorites. And don't forget to subscribe for more spine-tingling stories. Until next time, stay safe and keep an eye on those shadows.